Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. When I first heard about the new tag by Matthew of Mayberry Book Club called A Book Steve Hasn't Read, I thought it was very clever and funny, but not necessarily something I would really want to search out to watch. But as I've watched a few of them, I see how wrong I was. The videos are a lovely tribute to Steve Donoghue, as Samuel Durham points out so well in his video. But they're also pulling out such interesting aspects about the personalities of other booktubers, sharing with us what often appears at the edges of their reading taste, books that aren't necessarily on the shelves of other booktubers. I loved watching Brian at Bookish share a lesser-known novel that he loves by an author that means a lot to him. Kathy at Grim Reads shared a couple of books written by her mother, etc. So I thought I'd add to the story my first book. When I was a second-year French student in high school, my teacher brought in a lovely little hardback full of poetry, Mots d'Or. The words of ours were aptly named. The book kept my class enthralled for quite a long time. Publishing these poems in 1967, the author claimed that he was presenting recently discovered medieval French verse. There is some internal evidence that this may not be, in fact, true. These poems, as puzzling as they may at first seem, offer up a very rich reward for all who read patiently. Recite them aloud a few times, especially savoring the rhythmic sounds of the verses, to hear these strangely familiar sounds. Here's one example. Un petit Satan aux ailes, un petit a de great folle. These poems are followed by extensive footnotes. For example, one note suggests that the first line is clearly referring to the product of child marriage. However, as I hope you can tell from my atrocious French pronunciation, this is a work of homophonic translation. To hear more and to hear it read better, check out the link to the Guardian podcast at the comments. Have you read it, Steve? The second book I'm going to mention is Alfie Kohn's Unconditional Parenting, Moving from Rewards and Punishments to Love and Reason. Although I suspect you don't read many books about raising children, I don't think it's an unfair choice, since you do read books aimed at young people. Unconditional Parenting is very widely read, and it deals with important questions that go beyond parenting, not just how parents treat children, but how society at large thinks about the value of all human beings. It's about an idea of respect for all, for approaching other humans where they are, not where we want them to be. It's been called an eye-opening book, a paradigm-shattering book. I'd love to hear if you've read it. Third is a book I don't especially recommend, but it's an analysis of a series of books I really love. The book I suspect you might not have read is Julian Lovelock's Swallows, Amazons, and Coots. I didn't discover Arthur Ransom's books until I was an adult, until after we had a child, but the books have become favorites of mine, as well as favorites of my son. I think I was looking at the series in a more analytical way than I might have if I'd fallen in love with them when I was a young person. Therefore, I was thrilled to see Lovelock's study of Ransom's series of a dozen adventure books. I didn't hate Lovelock's analysis by any means, but half the time I felt like he was saying the obvious, and the other half the time I was skeptical of his claims. Still, I'd love to know if you've read this one. And how about this one? David Alpert's And the Skylark Sings With Me. Although it's less widely read than Unconditional Parenting, it is beloved by many readers who have been inspired by its message about the importance of listening closely to children and helping them find resources in their community to create educational opportunities for themselves. A lot of readers, including a lot of my friends, are annoyed by what they see as the author's bragging about his two gifted daughters. I read it differently. I saw it as his deep appreciation, his surprise, almost his awe at how amazing his children are, and how amazing all children are. He isn't bragging, in my view. He isn't taking credit for their accomplishments. Like Kohn's work, Albert's book opened up a way of thinking about how we express our respect for people who are not us, who are learning to express their own values and talents. If you've read this book, it will surprise and also delight me. My fifth suggestion is Stephanie Pearl-McPhee's The Yarn Harlot, The Secret Life of a Knitter. Again, I don't think this is breaking the rules of books you obviously wouldn't read. I could have chosen a book of patterns or knitting techniques. If you've read The Principles of Knitting, for example, I would eat my hat. But Pearl-McPhee's book is not that. Instead, it's a collection of essays that embrace the deep social meanings of crafting, with both gentleness and great wit. As the author says, it's a well-known fact that knitting is a sparkling form of entertainment, as spiritual as yoga, as relaxing as a massage, and as funny as Emma Bombeck trapped in a PTA meeting. This book is accessible, utterly charming, and a quick read. It's a book about connection and relationships. Have you read it? The next book is Reading Ruth by Judith Cates and Gail Twersky Reimer. Since you're a careful reader of the Bible as literature, I can imagine you might enjoy parts of this book if you've not read it. Cates and Reimer have put together a collection of diverse and contemporary feminist readings and rereadings of Ruth, some of which sound preposterous but wind up being interesting and in some cases very persuasive, while others are thoughtful and poetic. I suspect if you've read it, you probably didn't like all of it, but it's a book I've returned to many times over the years. On to the next book, Gertrude Himmelfarb's Jewish Odyssey of George Eliot. I've not read this book yet, but it's sitting on my shelf above my bed next to a more traditional biography of Eliot. I'm sure you've read some of Himmelfarb's other works, since she's a prolific historian, and I know you have a penchant to read authors' backlists and literary biographies. But this one? My eighth choice is a book that I read right after I graduated from college. I had just started graduate school in history, and this book made me think about how cultural and intellectual history could work in a way I'd never imagined. Published by Johns Hopkins University Press, the book I'm wondering if you have read is Stephen Stowe's Intimacy and Power in the Old South, Ritual in the Lives of the Planters. I've not read the book since that time, and I don't know if I would find it so transformative were I to read it now. At the time, the idea of taking microhistory to the level of the family rather than the community felt new and compelling to me. Did you read it? The next two books I am far less sure about. I suspect you may have read both of them. But in the spirit of books that meant a lot to me over the years, which also are on the outskirts of what booktubers typically choose to talk about here, I will try out two books by historians with whom I studied. The first is Like a Family, The Making of a Southern Cotton Mill World, written by Jacquelyn Hall and several other historians. I hope you are reading her brilliant new book, Sisters and Rebels, a biography of the Lumpkin sisters, but also an account of how region and history and family shape our politics and our political voices in complex ways. But Like a Family, published in 1987, is a classic and moving work that expanded the field of labor history and the field of social history in general. It's a beautifully written work. Looking at it now, I'm intrigued with how this book, almost written by a committee, presents such a coherent and poetic narrative. The second of these books by historians with whom I studied is Drew Faust's A Sacred Circle, The Dilemma of the Intellectual in the Old South. I'm sure you've read her masterful works, This Republic of Suffering, Death and the American Civil War, and you've almost certainly read her Mothers of Invention, Women of the Slaveholding South. But have you read all the way back in her backlist to A Sacred Circle? An analysis of 5 white Southern men who thought of themselves as intellectuals, this book traces, among other things, how Romanticism influenced their pro-slavery ideology. So, I have one bonus book. Initially, I was going to ask you if you had read Charles Joyner's Down by the Riverside, a South Carolina slave community. Charles Joyner was my father, and with this particular book, he, as he said, asked large questions in small places. Wildly, I recently discovered that Jason Harrigan had read it. which stunned me, but also made me realize that it might not be a good idea to think you might not have read it. An academic book published by a large university press, his book was widely read. My own academic book, published by a large university press, was published. So I'll ask you if you were one of the handful of people who read Unspeakable, the story of Junius Wilson. It was a heartbreaking book to write about a deaf African-American man in 20th century North Carolina and his experiences living through an era of race riots and lynching. The case where he was not found guilty but was nevertheless punished, his castration and long institutionalization, and the court case that finally kind of released him after he'd spent almost his entire life institutionalized. Any chance you've read this book, Steve? You will be in quite an elite group if you have. Thanks. I'm eager to hear if any of you who watch this video have read any of the books I've mentioned. I hope you are all having a lovely bookish weekend. See you soon on Hannah's Books.